Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to be hosting this panel. It's a conversation that I think is a huge topic that we need to be having within, especially the startup and entrepreneur communities. So I just wanted to give a brief sort of overview of myself. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So as we introduce the panelists, if you want to provide your pronouns as well, if not, that's totally fine. But yeah, if we just want to go through our panelists and if you want to give yourself a little introduction. If we want to start with Erica Fields.
Spencer.
Hi, I'm Erica Fields, she, her pronouns. I had a business that I just recently sold to my nephew, but I was involved in supplying rye to the distilleries and had been doing that for many, many years, and started my own company here 12 years ago, which I'll talk about later. I've also been one of the founding members of Civitas, the regional LGBT chamber, which is affiliated with the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce in DC. It's giving a lot of opportunity for LGBT businesses to connect, in network, certify as an LGBT business enterprise, and we're developing a pretty good program going forward. Spencer's been helping with that. I moved to Louisville 4 years ago, so I've been here since 2017, but I've been doing business down here for over 40 years.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as a member of Civitas, I appreciate all the hard work you all are doing for the community. Next is C's. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, what's up? I'm C's. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I am the co-founder of Rhythm Science Sound. We are a social enterprise based in Smoketown, which is a neighborhood in Louisville. So I'm a DJ, a music producer, and then a music tech educator. So a social enterprise means basically I take what little profits I have and kind of reinvest it back into community, as opposed to being a nonprofit, which comes with its own kind of rules and regulations you have to follow. The entrepreneurship allows me to just like depend on my own hustle to fund the community programs that I want to see. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Yeah. Nix, you want to go next?
Hey, I'm Nix. I go by mostly she or they. I previously in around 2016, I co-founded a startup here in Kentucky. We've since folded. Electronic hardware startups are very hard. And so now I actually work for, it's what I call a fake startup. It's an internal company within Kaplan, which is, you may have seen them in higher education. So we focus on data science boot camps. It's a kind of like learn to code in a few months approach to really like giving access to the tech world to people who would otherwise have a much more difficult path to accessing it. So now at Metis, I am executive director of content, building mostly new products and new content for us.
Fantastic. And finally, Britt, do you want to wrap us up?
Hey everyone, great to see all of you. I'm Britt Fitzpatrick. My pronouns are she, her, and I am originally from Louisville, Kentucky, but I'm currently in Northern Kentucky where I lead an organization called Blue North, which is a hub for startups and small businesses. Our job is to equip entrepreneurs with the resources that they need to start or grow successful early stage businesses.
Awesome, thanks so much. So speaking of, being in these male-dominated fields, Erica, you were talking about working in the bourbon industry, and I really can't think of maybe more of a traditionally visibly male-dominated field. How is that coming out in that world?
Well, it's interesting because I've been doing this for 40 years. Basically, I'm a grain merchant, but I've been focusing on supplying rye, the grain, to the distilling industry, and I've been doing that since 1978. In 2007, I started my own business, Brooks Grain, to do that. I'd worked for multinationals and for other major grain companies over the years doing it, and there never was a focus on my business that needed to be there to really make it successful. So I started my own business. At the time, I had not begun my transition, and it was shortly after beginning or starting the business in '07 that I began to transition. So it was kind of a twofer. I'm going out on my own, and I'm also beginning to become my true self. So it was a real challenge. The bourbon industry obviously is very male dominated, not nearly like it used to be, and many of those people are much more open-minded than they were when I first started in the industry. When I went through the transition, I didn't follow the normal WPATH, I guess, protocols. I found a counselor that would work with me and allow me to transition without having to completely reveal until I had my business in order because of the risk involved. And so over a period of 6-8 months, I was able to bring my daughter, who was very accepting and really wanted to see the family business, because it basically was somewhat of a family business, carried forward. So she came to work with me, and we developed a plan to allow me to transition and then come out to the industry after a period of time, rather than have that whole group of people go through the transitional period with me at the same time. My daughter, meanwhile, was pretty much the marketing person and was the person they interacted with. I would talk to them on conference calls, etc. But we put the plan together, and then we approached each customer and kind of handicapped where we felt they were as a company in terms of their internal, diverse, protocols and policies, as well as their marketing and where they stood. So we could kind of figure out where they were and how best to approach them when it came time to say, hey, listen, here's the situation. And actually it worked really well. My business partners at the time, we came out to them about 5-8 months after the beginning, and they were accepting and got involved in the process of trying to figure out the best way to present it to people. When we finally did present it to the customers, I was pleasantly surprised that there really wasn't any pushback. Fortunately, again, this was a while ago. It was in 2008-9 when I finally came out to the industry. Most of these companies already had diversity programs going. They were all involved in the HRC Equality Index to a great extent. So they already had a base of knowledge that these are things that they have to deal with, and they can't just look at it from their personal perspective if it were different than what you would hope. And so we actually were quite successful. In fact, in 2010, I had a meeting with Jack Daniels, owned by Brown-Forman, but we were down in Tullahoma, and I was asked point blank by one of the plant people that I'd known for 40 years whether or not Brooks Grain was a certified LGBT business. And if not, could we become one? Because that's how far along they were in terms of trying to develop a diverse supplier base. So I was very pleasantly surprised. Now, of course, there was a little bit of friction here and there, but nothing that I would have expected. And so I was very, very fortunate. And I also found that there was a tremendous number of women that were coming into the industry. Part of the reason I felt comfortable coming out was Beam Suntory at the time had a woman that they brought in as their head procurement person, the first woman to come in about 2007, 2006. She did a brilliant job of leading them forward. And since then, there's been more women coming in as master distillers, as officers, and it's really been nice to see how the industry is leveling out and not becoming strictly male dominated. And that's from the corporate side of it, or from the production side of it. Marketing still, I'm sure people look at a Jack Daniels ad and they don't see that diversity, but on the inside, I'm very pleased to see that a lot of these corporations and a lot of these customers that we have are very open.
That's fantastic. So glad to hear that. Nix, you're in tech, and that's also seen as a hugely traditionally, you think of the tech bro. How is being in the tech world, especially in tech education? How has that been for you?
Yeah. I could go on forever. It has been a ride, like a pretty wild ride. I'll say, I think, especially being trans, everyone's kind of path is a little bit different. And so I'm really glad that Erica mentioned kind of doing things a little bit differently than like the conventional W path kind of approach. So for me, I actually, very interestingly, had kind of a parallel experience to Erica. So I came out actually as a grad student in a fairly technical lab that was really male dominated. Was also kind of pleasantly surprised with how everyone took it. But also, I just like my first year of transition was like the worst year of my life. It was literally hell for a lot of other reasons, and I was not very productive, and not for any discriminatory reasons, but they ended up actually cutting ties with me just because I like wasn't doing my best work anymore. And so I was then kind of placed onto the job market unwillingly, very, very early in transition. And my startup that I co-founded here in Kentucky was, frankly, it was like a little bit of an avoidance mechanism. I didn't have to interview for it. I was the CTO. It was like, it actually let me kind of chart my own path and like make sure that I didn't have to worry about like anybody being assholes. And in some ways it was a really, really good decision. Anybody who's had a startup though, especially an early stage one, knows that like you don't start a startup to get a good paycheck. Like maybe years from now you have a dream of that, but early on there was a lot of sacrifices that I had to make to kind of make that happen. And really my decision to kind of go into education happened after that startup had to fold. So I was in this place. I actually could have been a full stack developer or a data scientist. I chose data science because it is a more inclusive field. And that's not to give it too much praise. It's still, I think, 70-30 male, men to women, if you don't count non-binary people. So it's not perfect. It has a lot of room to kind of improve, but it's definitely better than your like conventional software development. I also I have a lot of qualms about kind of the way that both like tech companies in general and data science specifically is conducted, a lot of the kind of impacts of it. And so my way of kind of avoiding any difficult situations where I was working for a company and I didn't super believe in their mission was really to go into education where, it's my classroom. I get to teach and kind of make sure that every lesson I have is ethically grounded, that I get to sort of monitor students' projects and ensure that students aren't sort of in a misguided, or like a lot of new people have a tendency to just kind of overlook the implications of what they're doing. And I got to like really teach those lessons. So that was I think like a great experience for me. I love teaching and I'm super grateful I had that opportunity. Erica also mentioned, I think, something really important, which is just that like I'm trans. There weren't any trans people at the company I currently work at when I got hired, but the chief data scientist who really kind of vouched for me after my teaching presentation was a woman, and she was the only woman at the C-suite of the major boot camps in the country. And it really, like, being introduced to that company, when I was like interviewing them, that was a huge plus to know that I don't necessarily need to have like a ton of queer people with rainbow flags at the like very front of the company, but I need to know that it's not going to be like your conventional kind of bro-y establishment. And so that was another kind of, it's a coincidental that it's similar, but I think it's a really important thing to note is that you can kind of, there's subtle ways that you can suss out kind of a company's priorities.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. I think that's something we should look back to in a minute. But I think, C's, I mean, I would imagine that you relate to a lot of that as a founder yourself. Just the mentality of creating your own company, creating your own guidance. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think, when Nix was talking, I was like typing in the chat. Like, I think for queer folk, for marginalized identities, for someone like myself who is non-binary, it made so much more sense to create my own lane as opposed to try to like conform myself to spaces that were never going to be meant for me, right? Even if I go into other educational settings, there are often pedagogies in place that are not critical of these established systems, right? And so being able to not only kind of carve out my own lane in terms of who I work with as an artist, who I approach for partnership, for relationship building, but also when I'm pulling young people and community into education, it's a space where we can enact very different pedagogies than we see in traditional school systems, in higher institutional education, where we can actually just put possibility models in front of people to say, yes, I know that you've always been conditioned to think woman, man, masculine, feminine, but there's so much more outside of that, right? And to even give people like a glimmer of that, or just like a one-off experience that there might be something different, I think opens up a window and a dialogue for these conversations to grow deeper and further, which is, you know, kind of what I always want as an artist, as an educator, as an entrepreneur, is to be able to push spaces to think differently than we've always been told to think.
Absolutely. You know, and speaking on allyship, you know, going back to the idea that we don't have to have, you know, 50 people in a company with rainbow flags flying to feel safe. Allyship is just as important. And Britt, as an ally, how do you see that, and how do you see your role as an ally in your company, in regards to there not having to be, you know, exactly a specific number of queer people or trans people or non-binary people, but rather an openness and a community-centered mentality for your company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing for me is, you know, I can't identify myself as an ally for a certain type of community. It's for the community to identify me as an ally. And that requires, you know, in this context, decentering my own experiences from the conversation, decentering my own experiences and placing someone else's experiences in that spot. So I think the first thing is making sure that you're hiring and working with people who have a certain degree of emotional intelligence and empathy. Because without that, you're never going to create an inclusive community of any type for anybody. And I think the second thing is, you know, it's similar to how we, not to make false equivalents, but since we're talking about startups, you know, when you're first starting a company, you're building something, they tell you to go talk to the customer and make sure that you're building from a user-centric standpoint. So if we're building a community that is modeled to be inclusive of certain types of underrepresented or marginalized individuals, then it's our job to go to the community and ask questions, put ourselves in spaces where we're amongst the community and meeting them where they are and asking them, you know, what does this look like for you? And being open to critical feedback. And so I think there are small things that we've done in terms of language, and we're still learning and wanting to improve those things. I think Sis spoke really eloquently about the importance of that. But certainly there's more work to be done, I think, in the state as a whole, to make sure that we have a community that's inclusive, of this community in particular. And I'm putting myself in spaces and just trying to, again, just decenter myself from the conversation as much as possible.
Yeah, and sort of opening the questions up to the group as a whole. You know, I think a lot of what you've touched on there is allowing yourself the authenticity, to be your true self, but also to receive others' true selves back to you within your company. So how for those who have come out, have you found your business growing, your work life improving when you were able to bring your authentic self to that workplace?
Is that question for me?
For anyone in the group.
Okay,
Erica,
sorry.
did you feel that your business was able to expand, or that your business life was enriched when you were able to be more authentic within yourself publicly?
Absolutely, but I also think there's a little bit of privilege attached to being able to be fully who you are when you're not the norm, or the sort of image of success within that particular field. I know we've talked a lot about how tech and data science, other fields, how it's typically, a white man. In the position that I'm in, it's typically an older white guy who has the job that I have. And so I think there's another level of courage and self-care and self-awareness and support that's needed when you're underrepresented or marginalized and coming into a space and then making the decision to own the fullness of who you are and bring that to your work. It's not something that's always welcomed. It's not something that's always rewarded. And sometimes it's not safe either. So.
Fantastic. Yeah, does anyone else have any experience with changes to your workplace environment in that regard?
Yeah, I kind of actually have a complicated answer to that question. I think a premise of that is that as we come out, as we get to be our authentic selves, we are like better off, or like the workplace is better off in some way. I actually think that a lot of times that doesn't happen. So for me, when I first came out, like I had an extremely unproductive year. If the graduate lab that I was in just wanted to publish the most papers, then they shouldn't hire trans people. Like, I'll just be straight up about that. Like, supporting any sort of marginalized group, but especially I will just speak to the trans experience. It shouldn't be done from the perspective of like, oh, we will improve kind of our bottom line if we do this. And I think that that's like a big point to make. It also, I think for any trans people out there, it's like, it's worth acknowledging, like, if you come out and then you're not like the superhuman version of yourself, like that's super okay. Like that happens to everybody, and it's really freaking difficult to actually make all of this work. That said, I think that there are benefits. Like I don't think the premise of the question is completely broken. I just think that they're very indirect, and I think like my company, as being an education company, supporting women in general, trans people specifically, it meant that as trans students kind of went through the company, we had one student, it was the first student who came, they were the first student who came through using they, them pronouns. Like, it was my first year at the company, nobody even mentioned this to me, and there was a lot of friction kind of internally around it. And when I found out about the student and a few slip-ups, I was like, mama bear. But then after the student actually graduated and started leaving reviews, they were super stoked actually about the experience. So it was so rewarding to get to see the other side, where they said like this was the first chance that they had to use their like own pronouns in their career. They were super it was like super rewarding to be supported by Metis. And it was just like, it was really nice to kind of see that even though like I get a little bit like mama bear, I get a little bit kind of tense around these things internally, that the company's really doing a good job externally, and that hard work and that friction and those difficult conversations actually are paying off. And that's kind of, I think that's the right way to look at it, is not just like what are the benefits, but like it's a big trade-off and it's not always easy, but it should be worth it in the end.
Interestingly, in my situation, it was a little bit different in that, I was involved in supplying customers a product for them to make their product, and they were involved in the other side of it, of marketing it, et cetera, et cetera. And most of these people I had known for years. So when I came out, for a lot of them, it was, they were familiar with me as a human being, but now they were actually seeing me as who I really was. And I was very pleased to see how the continuity of the business continued, and there was no focus at all really on my transition, but rather on our ability to work together as supplier and customer. And over the especially in the first few years, it was really gratifying for me to see that the focus was just continuing on the business. And I think it did help that I had my daughter working with me, because I think it just subliminally gave them the sense that, okay, the family's, you know, together. And so it took the focus completely off of it. So I think in a very subconscious way, I was able to give people an opportunity to interact and be with someone in the trans community that none of them really had ever done before, in a way that allowed them to, when they were interacting in the future with someone within the trans community, to have that experience. And so it was kind of unique. So I didn't really see a huge difference. I think there was a lot of people that felt, you know, some sense of that I had done something that they felt was courageous. I'm not courageous. I just finally couldn't be who I was. I had to be who I really am. But no, I saw a real continuity, and it was kind of nice to be able, speaking of education, without going anywhere or doing anything, really giving people an opportunity to begin their process of understanding a whole community.
So in terms of you know, that topic of being sort of almost a walking encyclopedia for others, is that something that, you know, that's a burden that I think a lot of queer people, non-binary and trans people face, is especially if, you know, Erica, you being maybe the first person that they had met who was trans, but they knew you already. Is that a burden that you all have found in your working careers, that having to be the walking encyclopedia, having to explain the issues that, you know, that affect you in that certain workplace, or you know, with having your own startup, is that something that you've been able to not have to deal with?
Well, real quick, since, you know, my transition occurred in 2007 to 2009, in that range, you know, it was relatively early in a lot of these people's lives where the trans community really wasn't visible at that time. Initially, there's a lot of, especially people that I'd known for a long time and had considered as not just a customer, but a friend. You know, there were some personal questions, but usually it was pretty respectful. And when it kind of bordered on a little TMI, I just would basically turn it down and say, look, you know, that's something I'd rather not discuss. But it wasn't long, and then people just kind of went on. And I'd say probably for the first year or so, there was a number of questions, but and understandable. I mean, again, I'm a bit older. I'm a boomer. Sorry, everyone. You know, so I mean, I understood why a lot of these people would ask the questions they did, because I probably would have as well. And so, you know, it didn't bother me personally, but I also understood where there needed to be boundaries.
Yeah, on this one, kind of, again, I have a little bit of a complicated answer. What you're bringing up, sort of this sort of situation where often your identity becomes your own burden, whether you like it or not, is super real. It happens to a lot of people. And I think for anyone who's not trans in the audience, it's worth kind of paying attention to that and just giving a little thought to, like, oh, I thought this question was innocuous, but maybe I'm just like making things really annoying. I also think trans people, like, whether we want to or not, like, we are just always strategic about this. And so, like, I go by both she and they. In a perfect world, I would probably just go by they. But it's like, frankly, it's like a lot easier. And so I have a lot of respect for someone like C's, who's just like, I'm sure that every conversation you go into, like, I've been there. Like, you either have to basically like have an explainer for these pronouns that are super new to everybody, or you just have to like eat it when they misgender you, like, every time. And that's a terrible calculation. I think the experience differs also kind of where you're at in your career and in a company. An incredible thing about being at the like head of a classroom and teaching is like I've had hundreds of students come through my classroom. I have never once been misgendered by the students. And I don't think everybody just imagines that I'm like perfectly cis. Like I typically don't try to hide like who I am, but it's like when you have that kind of command of people's attention and that position of authority, people really do like they don't mess with you. And I say that to acknowledge the other side of that experience, which is just that like early on when I was in different places, it just like it was completely different, and I had to make that decision of, do I like make a big deal of this and need to be the walking encyclopedia, or do I eat it and just like try to forget about it? And I think those are when I had to make that decision more, the most refreshing thing was actually when I just like could get through an interaction or like a part of my day and just like not even like think of it. Like it literally like didn't come up. And I think especially for cis people who it's like the trans experience is kind of new to you, it can be exciting. It can be really fun to be an ally. And there's a temptation to kind of make it about you and to like really kind of connect in that experience. And I want to caution people from that kind of approach, because like really what we're looking for is just like do our job and get through the day. And I think like the last part of this I'll point out, and this is really for like other queer and trans people and really other minorities, is that you are often put in a position where in order to like make the world a better place or your company a better place, you have to do a ton of work. And so my example is like Erica mentioned the HRC, the Human Rights Council. They do an incredible job kind of basically assessing companies and how inclusive they are of LGBT folks. One big piece for trans people is healthcare. It's like everybody covers bottom surgery, but there's like a huge list of blanket exclusions that every major health insurance company just excludes by default. And so every trans person who goes through these companies is basically required to either like front thousands of dollars of their own medical costs up front for things that their doctors say are necessary, but their insurance doesn't. Or they have to confront their employer and they have to like move this mountain to get their employer to change healthcare, which if anybody's ever done that, you know, like that's not easy. And so there's been a few battles like that I've taken on, and I've been the walking trans encyclopedia. Like I literally wrote a white paper for my company on healthcare, and we're still in the painful process of getting that changed. And I think for the trans people in the room, I just want to kind of both give everyone permission to not feel like you have to do that, because that shouldn't be a part of your job. But if you want to, I think it's worth thinking about that as a service. It's like you should not feel obligated to fight all of these fights. It's like it can't all be on your shoulders. And so just I have kind of a lot of compassion for anybody navigating those decisions.
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve.
I was just gonna say, like, speaking to some of these points, like, yes, I think the burden and onus is often put on our bodies in space where people just want to ask you questions or interrogate your experience. But also the beautiful thing for me about being an entrepreneur and running my own business is that's a service fee, right? Like, I operate in the world based on relationships. So if you and I already have a pre-established relationship and you fuck up my pronouns, like we're gonna have a conversation and I'm gonna hope you're gonna do better in the future. But if you are a business, if you are coming to me because you need music produced for your play, your commercial, etc., and you can't get my pronouns right, or you expect the onus to be on me to educate you about something you're not hiring me for, again, it's going to be a service fee. Like I will not have someone assault my dignity because they think it's okay. And because I don't perform androgyny, they think that I'm just somehow like woman light and they can just girl or cis or she, her, me all day long. And that's not something that I'm willing to be a part of. And it is exhausting to sit here and say, like, I understand you've been conditioned to only see two genders in the world. However, your conditioning is wrong. And I'm willing to give people grace because, again, it's hard. Our imaginations have been contoured by a hegemony that says if you are not white, if you are not cis, if you are not male, you have significantly less value. So I get it. I get that it's hard. But what I'm not willing to do is have someone, yeah, it's try to take away my dignity because they don't understand my experience. And I think because of how I navigate in the world, I try to, as much as I can, take jobs and create partnerships and collaborations where I know the integrity of the organizations I work with, and I know that they're willing to see people in their full humanity. That's not to say that I don't sometimes take jobs, right? Occasionally, when we were gathering in public and doing things, right, an easy way for me to make money is to DJ out at bars and venues. And to speak to Britt's point, it's not always safe to choose these battles in space. It's not always safe for me to be like, you know what, bar venue owner, you're not getting my pronouns right. Like, what the F? Because A, it could cause bodily harm to me in those spaces. But B, I have had, like choosing those battles, people not pay me at the end of the night. So is it safe for my wallet? Is it safe for my body? Is it safe for my soul to kind of go into those battles and spaces? And if I don't already have a pre-established relationship with someone, yeah, like someone said, like sometimes you just eat it and you're like, whatever. Because at the end of the day, like I'm always going to be non-binary, and someone using the wrong pronoun isn't going to affect who I am at my core and my soul,
Yeah, and to that point, Steve, as someone who also works in sort of the arts as well, I've found that within the art community, especially, the lines tend to blur. It's not as, it's not typically as corporate of a field. So the relationships tend to get a bit more, you're out DJing at a bar, you're not sitting at a desk at noon, in a corporate office. Have you found that working in the arts that those lines get blurrier than in an office space?
I think, like we always have to complicate these questions. I think there are ways that those lines are maybe blurred when we're out in space, like a bar or a venue, but also having worked in other like more kind of corporate spaces, I think there's a rigidity to those boundaries where like if a company doesn't understand non-binary and they don't want to do that work, like they're not even going to acknowledge that you've said anything, right? Where in the art world, there is a lot of fluidity between gender, between play, between performance, right? Between presentation, that people, I think, at times are more willing to have those conversations. And again, it's about relationship building and that safety piece. Like, is it safe for me to engage in these conversations? And oftentimes it is, and oftentimes people are like mad responsive. Recently I had a new council person email me asking me to be in a video and being like, we don't have enough women. And I was like, hey, like real quick, I'm non-binary. And the response was just like, yo, like, thank you for correcting me, and I'm gonna do better in the future. And I didn't even think about whether or not we had non-binary representation, So like, I think there are spaces where those conversations are absolutely able to happen in the arts world in like some really productive ways.
Another thing that I think, again, helped me at the beginning, but also I've been involved with over time with other organizations, is having resources that are there, whether it's from the HRC, the NCTE, which is the National Center for Transgender Equality, actually on a business platform, the NGLCC also has quite a bit of resources. And there's a number of other organizations out there. Speaking of healthcare, when I was in Minnesota, I was on the board of a group called Gender Justice, and we did a lot of gender equality work. One of the cases that they took was against United Health, and it had to do with their internal healthcare system, which was not trans inclusive. So there's organizations that are out there and that can give you information, that can give you materials, that can give you support in having conversations with whether it's an employer, whether it's a corporate customer or whoever, to help you, not just stand there alone trying to convince them of how they should approach something. And I think it's important that people are aware of that and that they know where they can turn to.
Absolutely. Britt, so, when you're working, in the startup world, how do you find, those resources? How do you make sure that those resources are available for the companies you're working with, that you're working in? As someone not in the community, how do you go and find those needed and those necessities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, at the end of the day, there's a base set of resources that any entrepreneur or startup is going to need. And so I can't remember if it was C's or Nick's that brought up this point of, I think it was Nick's actually, of ultimately you just want to do your thing. Like that's like what you're there to do. So the goal for us at Blue North is really to normalize having different kinds of people in shared space in a community, coming from different backgrounds and identities and vantage points, and just for that to be normal. Like, but not so much that they're, not so much that people aren't celebrated for their differences. We're not trying to create a colorblind or a gender blind sort of community, but that it's not something that you have to, there's not a burden for people to explain their identities or their backgrounds, that it's just a normal occurrence. So with that being said, working with an entrepreneur who's from the LGBTQ plus community is similar to working with any entrepreneur in the instance that they're still going to need the same resources that any entrepreneur would need in terms of capital, and mentorship and other types of connections. Where it becomes nuanced is our team would want to make sure that, again, the connections that we're placing in front of that entrepreneur are going to be those that are going to create, not going to create unsafe, spaces for them, that they also are educated or committed to the same type of inclusivity that we are. So, I think there's just more sort of thought and care put into it in that sense. And that, the connections that we make, we take very personally. And so we'd want to make sure that we're putting people in spaces where they're going to be served and treated with respect and dignity, and where they're going to maintain their agency over their business. So I think that's just where the nuance comes in. But in general, we're building a community for entrepreneurs, period. Like regardless of, color, gender identity, rural, urban, whatever. We want to make sure that everyone has inequitable access to those resources.
Fantastic. And C's, you were talking a little bit earlier about how things have shifted, with, previously you were doing performances, things like that. How has COVID affected your business? Are you able to shift toward more online education? What's been going on?
Yeah, so luckily a lot of the work that I do in terms of youth education could be pivoted online. Last week, I actually started an in-person class again for some youth in our neighborhood. It's a small group of about 8 students. Yeah, obviously I haven't DJ'd out or performed since last March, which has been very difficult. I'm kind of in streaming hell in terms of just like performance. But doing youth education and then picking up contracts for production work for music. So being able to produce music for plays, being able to produce music for film, that has been a revenue source at the moment. And it's been difficult. Yeah, I mean, this year has been hard, I think, for everybody in terms of like financially understanding like what your needs are, what your wants are, and how to pivot. Right now, I'm just thankful, yeah, that youth education can happen online, I miss hosting events and gathering people in community, because I think that's just such an important way that we kind of build and bridge some of these divides we're talking about, right? Like when we're in space together, moving together, dancing together, sharing food together, it's much easier to see one another's shared humanity. So that's been very difficult. But yeah, it's a blessing that because I know the tech world, because I know how to do things through online applications, and we're always searching out ways for young people to access music production technologies that are free or open source, that I kind of had a resource bin to pull from when we needed to go online.
Awesome. And just to open it up to everyone, do you see any resources, especially within the business world, that are needed, that are necessary? Are there any action items that you would like to see within the entrepreneur world for our communities?
I would just say, speaking generally, I think we still have a ways to go when it comes to intersectionality, even within our conversations around marginalized groups. And so I would like to just see more of that so that we can get, selfishly, so that we can get better data and understanding of what those needs are. Right now, for me, it's been very much sort of small group, small batch focus, which is fine because you're able to have intimate conversations. But I do feel like there are some giant holes within our current understanding because we're still missing intersectionality within these different groups that we're trying to reach and to serve better.
Absolutely. I think intersectionality is so important, and the bedrock of how we all grow, both business-wise and as entrepreneurs and within our startups. So I just wanted to open it up. We have a few minutes left. Wanted to open it up to anyone in the comments. If anyone wants to ask any questions of our panelists, you can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat. Either way.
What would be a good beginner's resource to really inform or teach employees, whether it be the differences between the words gender, sex, orientation? What would be a good beginner's resource?
Well, once again, as I'd mentioned earlier, there's a number of organizations that have material available, and some of them are well known, some are not. The HRC actually has a tremendous amount of information available. I know that the National Center for Transgender Equality also has quite a bit of information available. And then I think reaching out to organizations, one of the things we do at Civitas is any of our members or anyone who has a question about any topic in the overall LGBTQ community and business can reach out, and we can get information from our kind of parent organization, the NGLCC. So I guess the question, Mike, is more, what type of information do you want, or is needed in the conversation you're talking about, or that you're going to engage in, and then trying to tailor the information for that.
Well, and I also would just like to point out, as Spencer just linked in the comments, that Queer Kentucky, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, does have trans inclusive training workshops that is, as someone asked, sort of training the trainer. They have incredible workshops for that, and they're just an incredible resource in general for any sort of additional information. All right, anyone else have any final questions? Going once, going twice. I think that might be about it. Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists and everyone who attended. This has been an incredible conversation. And I'm just so glad that we've had such amazing interest and turnout for this talk. And if any of our panelists have any final words, please go for it. But just from my end, thank you all so much.
I just wanted to say thank you to Civitas and Queer Kentucky and the other organizations that are doing really great work, really grassroots work to pull this community together and to invite allyship as a part of it. I think it's much needed, and I know it's hard work, and so I just wanted to express my gratitude for those folks.
I would like to have a quick mention that in November of 2021, there's going to be a trans conference going on that Sarah McKinney at the U of L is putting together. She's in the initial planning stages now. I think they've done it for a number of years, and I've been talking with her. I'll be talking to her again this afternoon about some of the things that they're planning on doing, but that'll be a wonderful opportunity for people to gather and if there's ideas or topics that you think would be pertinent or that you could add to, I urge you to reach out to Sarah. You can reach her on Facebook at the Kentuckiana Trans Support Group. But it's going to be pretty exciting, and she's got a pretty good head start on getting it going.
Awesome. Well, we'll be glad to make sure we push that out through all the organizations as well. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Mike, any last words before we log off here?
That's it from me. Everyone from Amplify, we are very appreciative of you all joining us to really work on improving our ecosystem. Amplify is super grateful to all of our panelists and to you, Sarah, for moderating this panel. Again, if you like what you heard today and you want to learn about more events that Amplify is throwing, please go to amplifylouisville.com to sign up for our newsletter. We talk about the news and the ecosystem. We celebrate our wins. We also just launched a brand new job board, but I'm going to go ahead and hit stop on the recording.